It's a bit like coming home. Now, Seattle is a long way from Memphis. But I first sang "There Shall a Star Arise Out of Jacob" as an alto. Sitting in front of the stained glass windows, staring out at the rows of pews. And it's also a bit like homecoming because of the people I've met as I've gotten here. You know, Alex and Helen reminding me of New York, which, you know, I'm sorry, you never escape all the places you've been, and I'm not actually interested in escaping them. They've all blessed my lives. And then to see Alvin back, I don't know Alvin Queeram. I've met him, I don't know him. But when I was still young, I don't know how old this makes you, Alvin. When I was young and reading Spectrum magazine, there was this guy named Alvin Queeram. I was so impressed. So it takes me back to good times. I'm coming from a church that was difficult to leave. 14 years makes you part of family. You know, as one of the kids was saying, "Pastor, you can't go. You're the only pastor I've ever known." It's true. So it was painful to leave, but I'm excited to be here. It's an incredible honor to be here. I look forward to getting acquainted with you. I look forward to getting acquainted with the communities of Wallingford and Fremont and the university. In spite of my life on the farm, I treasure life in the city. It's where I've always dreamed of doing ministry. And it's an incredible honor to be invited to do ministry in this city. A few personal notes. One of the things that a number of people ask me, well, what about, you're going to have office hours? No. But the only reason I'm not is because when I ask a little further, they said, well, actually, we're not really wanting to know, are you going to go sit on your hiney in a room somewhere waiting for us to walk through the door? But can we get a hold of you? Yes. And if you're sitting around going, you know, I'd really like to talk to that guy. I wonder when's the best time to call him. Well, no, it's probably not good now. If you're trying to think, when would be a good time to call? Think Sunday or Tuesday. Now, if you want to, you can call anytime you want. But if you're one of those people going, I don't want to disturb, I've met people like this. You know, they're members of the church, they're paying me, and then they go, well, I was going to call you, but I didn't want to bother you. So if you're sitting there going, I don't want to bother him, okay, call me on Sunday or Tuesday. You won't be bothering me. Otherwise, call me whenever you want. I'm assuming my phone number will show up somewhere. Anyway, call Carolyn and she can tell you how to track me down. I take Mondays off. If you're not dying, leave me alone. Sundays and Wednesdays, I intend to be pretty intensely focused on visiting with people. I'd like to get acquainted with you. And if you'd like to see me sooner than, 3 years from now, call me up and let me know. I'll put you higher on the list. Thursdays, not Friday, though it does happen. Thursdays are supposed to be sermon day. And I try to take that pretty seriously. So I look forward to getting acquainted. Thank you so much for the honor of being invited to serve you and to serve God here. Years ago in Akron, Ohio, I'd been there probably a couple of years. A lady stopped me and found me in the lobby after church. Not at the door. She waited until she could talk to me without interruption. She came up and she was kind of timid, and I knew who she was, but didn't know her well. Pastor, do you think you could baptize my daughter? Now, I mean, in Adventist clergy circles, I mean, that's how you prove you're worth your pay, baptizing people. I mean, yes, of course I can baptize your daughter. I mean, I'd be honored. I'm thrilled. We'll just set up some studies and we'll get her ready. And yeah, of course I'll baptize your daughter. Now, I should have, even as I'm saying that to her, there's another part of my brain talking to me, going, wait a minute, why is mom asking me this? Where is this daughter I'm going to baptize? I'd never seen a young person with her. I'd never seen anyone with her. But, well, I'd already said, of course, yes. Let's just set up some studies. I mean, that covered my bases. You don't understand. And she, using the language of that time and place, she said, Annie is retarded. I said, no problem. We'll make them really simple. She said, no. You don't understand. Annie is severely retarded. I'm not sure what language we would use today to describe her developmental difficulties, but they were substantial. Annie was 20 years old, in diapers, nonverbal, if by verbal you mean actually language that anybody can understand. I had never seen Annie because she was given to significant vocal outbursts. And Mom didn't feel comfortable bringing her to church, didn't know how that would work out. Now, Mom knew she was asking us to bend the rules, because Adventists practice believer's baptism. We don't just baptize kids because Mom and Dad say so. For profound theological reasons. It's part of our regard for the integrity of persons. The baptism is a statement that whether we're talking about little people or big people, that when it comes to their engagement with God, we don't own them. It's part of our regard for human freedom and liberty. Our doctrine says it, the policy book says it, tradition says it. And Mom wants me to kind of do an end run around all that. But she minimized the rule breaking by assuring me, I tell Annie all the time that Jesus loves her. And I think she understands. In fact, I think sometimes she says Jesus. It's not very clear, but I think that's what she's saying. And of course, I'm thinking, that has to do with your mom's heart, not with Annie's words. Now, maybe some of you would have suggested, well, we can explain things to the mother. That God has a capacity to save people apart from the water that we control. I'll leave you to try to explain that to a mother who is standing there saying, will you baptize my 20-year-old baby who is in diapers and who will never be out of diapers? For Mom, baptism was the doorway to the kingdom of heaven and the doorway to the church, the family of God. Would I welcome her daughter standing in for Jesus? Church doctrine is unambiguous. Church policy is equally clear. And it all gets washed out in the light that shines from Jesus. The people sitting in darkness have seen a great light. Whenever Jesus showed up, it was bright. And we baptized Annie, breaking another rule, in a private ceremony, so that the vocalizations would not embarrass Mom. and we welcomed her into the family of God. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, Galilee of the Gentiles, listen up. The people sitting in darkness have seen a great light. Matthew's words, borrowed by Matthew to announce that Jesus is getting ready to do something. He's getting ready to begin his ministry. I'm intrigued with the use of these obscure tribal names, Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, you all know about those people, right? They're famous. Not. They're not famously bad. This isn't Ahab or Jezebel. And they're certainly not famously good. My guess is, if you didn't pull out your iPhone and Google it, you don't know anything about these people. Except maybe you've heard of them. And that's all that the names are good for. They're really placeholders. Zebulun and Naphtali were some tribes kind of up to the north. Nobodies. It was Auburn and Federal Way. Or maybe Morton. Yeah. They actually do appear in the Bible a little bit more often than some other tribes that are even more obscure. But the Bible tells us nothing about them except they're there. They exist. The darkness of Zebulun and Naphtali is not some special demonic thing. It's not some horror that's worth telling about. It is the darkness that commonly haunts the human condition, especially the human condition of the nobodies. They had no connection with the monarchy, no connection with the temple, not with the priesthood. They weren't famous as warriors. They're just people. And Annie's mom was just people. People sitting in darkness have seen a great light. Those were Matthew's words announcing the beginning of Jesus' ministry. But they're not Jesus' words. When Jesus, the next verse, okay, Matthew says, Jesus is about to start his ministry, sound the trumpets. People sitting in darkness have seen a great light. What does Jesus say? The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent. Now, we really need to change that word repent because we've turned it into a religious word. It just means turn. Change direction. Why would you do that? One reason you do that is you turn hoping to find something, hoping to achieve something, grasping and reaching for something. But that's not the picture that Jesus paints. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is here, turn. It's like dinner is on. Duh, eat. On a rainy day in New York City, the taxi stops, sees you standing on the curb. What do? You get in. Jesus was announcing the arrival of the presence and favor of God. It is at hand. It is here, real close. The Advent season celebrates the beginning of the mission of Jesus, the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. It is the season of light. People who would never put up a cross take great joy in putting up the lights. It answers the deep hunger of our heart for light in the darkness in the midwinter. And the essence of the religion of Jesus is light. Now, with a story like Annie and her mom, it's so easy. We applaud. Yeah, so that's wonderful. That's great. Here you have this girl who is developmentally challenged, whose cognitive development is impaired. And we're going, well, duh, of course Jesus would open the kingdom. Now we need to be clear that what I've just said, we say, of course, in Adventist circles, but not in conservative Christian circles. You know, the head of the Southern Baptist Seminary in Dallas has written that only those who have an explicit, conscious faith in Jesus will avoid the default mode for all humanity, which is eternal torment. Annie was not capable of conscious, as far as we know, and certainly not capable of explicit faith. And we as Adventists have absolutely no trouble saying, you know, God doesn't have a problem with that. Her brain does not make God helpless. And I want to push us the other direction as well. What if the greatest spiritual darkness you face arises not from cognitive lack, but from cognitive development itself in the life of the church? Bob's a friend of mine. When we first met, he was feeling his way back toward church after some years away. Now, when we got acquainted, we share interests outside of church, and as he shared a story with me, the story is not uncommon. When he encountered Adventism for the first time, college student, his life was chaotic. I mean, he came from a upper middle class family and then discovered the freedom that we all did back a certain era. And his life had gone into really a tailspin. He was passing barely because of all the other stuff going on. And here came a religion that gave him structure. It answered questions. It gave him purpose. It gave him a worldview that worked and a pattern of life that countered the chaos in his life. It was the medicine he needed. Years later, he was a leader in his church, a paragon of Adventist virtue. And then questions that he had put away decades earlier insisted on coming back. The first one, perhaps the most troubling one, was not cognitive. Well, I guess it was cognitive in a sense. He did everything he was supposed to, did it with a sincere and whole heart. And he suspected that he was still pretty much the same guy that he was back then. No, he didn't have some of the dysfunctional behaviors, but Bob was still the same. Where was that new creature? He didn't see it. But he perhaps could have wrestled with that using some of the standard and reliable resources of Christian spirituality. But then his early college geology training came back to him. And he found himself no longer able to shoehorn his mind into the 6,000 years required by the church. And he told me, he said, well, I've just figured I'm going to be damned, and that's okay. It's a good thing I'm an Adventist because damnation doesn't last very long. I'm lost. Well, he knows me. And I did what he expected me to do. No, you're not. And besides, you're not the only one that questions 6,000 years. I can give you a whole list of people who are good Adventists that have some questions about that. And he goes, yeah, but that's just you talking. I know that officially what the church says. And I know if I talk to the people who are really in charge, he said, no offense. If I talk to people who really matter in this church, I'm lost. I told him this story, which I think illustrates the astonishing power of the light that shines forth from Jesus. Some of you are aware that in the early 2000s, the denomination had a series of 3 conferences on faith and science. Called together people from all over the world. The last conference, I went to all conferences as an observer, not a participant. The last conference was held in Denver and was the most tightly controlled of all of the conferences. No dissent was presented. And in fact, there was very vigorous, forceful presentations by a number of younger theologians demanding that the church not just talk about this, but fix it and make sure that it excluded from the church any hint of accommodation to those who did not buy that element of our creed exactly the way it was written. Friday, end of the week, Friday afternoon, there was a panel discussion. One of the leaders of the discussion was Fernando Canali, a guy at seminary who had been probably the most, he was the guy with the biggest hammer calling all week for the absolute purification of the church. A pastor who was, in fact, a delegate to these conferences, stood up and said, "Fernando, I need to ask you a question." Said, some years ago, I was doing an evangelistic series. There was this guy coming. He wanted to get baptized. He was already attending church. I found out, in fact, he was keeping Sabbath at some significant financial cost to himself. His wife was an Adventist. He was paying tithe. And he wanted to join the church. He wanted to be baptized. But he was a geologist, and he said there was no way he could buy 6,000 years. "Fernando, do I baptize this guy or not?" Fernando said, "Well, wait. No. We're talking theology here, okay? In these conferences, what you're asking me is a pastoral question. We're talking theology. We're talking about church doctrine. We're talking about requirements for employment. You need to make that kind of decision in the context of your own pastoral ministry and knowledge of the person." The pastor would not be quiet. He said, No. I've got to know, when I go back from here to my church, I want to know what kind of church you're wanting me to build. I want to know, will you baptize this guy? Fernando squirmed and wiggled. He did not want to answer it. But to his credit, after having spent a week with a hammer in his hand, trying to whack down every hint of accommodation within the church, he said, "Well, if I were a pastor and that man came to me, I guess I'd baptize him." And sitting there was Ted Wilson and Michael Hosel, and you do not get more orthodox than what I've just said. And there was not a single demurral. There is nothing more resistant to the light of Jesus than the structure of religion, because we build those structures in an attempt to be obedient to Jesus. And I don't make light of them at all. But when you have conservative theologians who have spent a week laying down the law, and then when presented with a real person, and they reluctantly cave, that says something extraordinary about the power of the light that shines from Jesus. Because those theologians knew, as anyone who has paid any attention to the stories of Jesus knows, that Jesus was presented with just that kind of question repeatedly during his ministry. And every time, he went the same direction. You remember the story, Matthew 15. Jesus is on retreat with his disciples. It's his day off. Nobody's dead. Leave me alone. He's on a retreat with his disciples. He's actually left Galilee, gone across the border into the pagan area north of the Jewish area, just so he can have some quiet time with his disciples. A woman, a local woman, a pagan, somehow finds out he's there. We don't know how. She finds out he's there, and she comes begging for help for her daughter. Now, we know the story too well. If you don't know the story and you just follow it through, listen, here's how the story goes. She is begging, this woman is begging Jesus, help me, my daughter. My daughter's life is being ripped apart by demonic forces. You can help her. You've got to help her. She's on him as only a mother can be. I'd ask Lowell, would you rather have an angry dad or an angry mom talking to you? I've not asked Lowell, but I can tell you if I was a principal, I'd rather talk to angry dad anytime. Mom is on Jesus saying, you've got to help me. You can, you must. Jesus ignores her. That doesn't work. So then Jesus says this. I will paraphrase so you get it, but this is what Jesus said. Woman, your situation is not my job. In fact, if I step into your request, I will be stepping out of the conditions of my divine calling. To help you goes contrary to the job I've been given by God to do. That's the plain meaning of what Jesus said to the woman. The woman says, well, then get busy and do it. Fernando Canali, Michael Hazel knew that if Jesus were allowed into the room, there's only one answer that could be given when faced with a question. Here is a person hungry for a connection with God that can be found through this church. Will you let him in? And just as Annie's cognitive development ought not be allowed as a barrier between her and entrance into the kingdom of heaven, so Bob's cognitive development ought not be a barrier either. The kingdom of heaven is not about our opinions, though there's a place for them. Hey, I like doing theology. I wrote a book about theology. I like theology. But theology is a servant, or ought to be, and not the master of the church. Most of us, somewhere in our lives, have encountered darkness. It's better when darkness is simply something you read in the paper or maybe see on the news. It's worse when it's something that is in your life. And it is triple times worse when it is in the life of people you love, especially your kids. The universal testimony of the Gospels is that when Jesus showed up, darkness was washed out. The people sitting in darkness have seen a great light. Merry Christmas.